The coffee machine at Patterson's Diner made a sound like a dying animal every morning at 5:47 a.m. And every morning at 5:47 a.m., Mara Ellison was the one who heard it first. She didn't mind, not really. Or she told herself she didn't. There was a strange comfort in being the only person awake in a sleeping town, flipping the chairs down from the tables, wiping the same sticky ring off the counter that never quite came clean no matter how many times she scrubbed it. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease that had soaked so deep into the walls it had become part of the building's bones. Mara had worked there for 3 years. Long enough to know which booth the regulars liked. Long enough to know that Mr. Castellano always tipped exactly 10%, never a cent more, and long enough to know that her life had quietly, almost politely, become smaller than she ever imagined it would be at 25. She hadn't planned this. Nobody plans this. 6 months ago, she still had a husband. 6 months ago, she still believed in things like permanence. "You're so dramatic, Mara," her sister Beth had said on the phone last week. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. "Plenty of people get divorced. You're young. You'll be fine." Fine. That word had started to feel like a slap dressed up as a compliment. Daniel had left on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with an almost cruel clarity. Not the big things, not even really what he'd said, but the smallness of it. A Tuesday. He'd folded his shirts. He always folded his shirts with this irritating precision, like he was still trying to impress some drill sergeant from a life he never actually lived. He folded his shirts, packed them into the same suitcase they'd taken to Cancun for their honeymoon, and told her, almost gently, like he was doing her a favor, that he didn't feel challenged anymore. Challenged, she'd repeated, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. His bedroom now, she supposed, since he was the one who got to walk away whole while she got to stay and disassemble what was left. "I don't know how else to say it," he'd said. "I need more out of life than this. This. Their apartment. Their dog, who he didn't even take. Her. She hadn't cried in front of him. She'd promised herself that much. She waited until his car pulled out of the lot, until the sound of his engine faded into the ordinary hum of the street, and only then did she sit down on the kitchen floor and let it come apart. Now, months later, she still caught herself doing the math in her head before falling asleep. Rent, $940. Diner paycheck, barely enough to cover it, plus the dog food, plus the gas to get to her second job stocking shelves at the Right Mart 3 nights a week. She didn't resent the work. She resented how invisible it made her feel, how a person could work 14-hour days and somehow still feel like they were sinking, slowly, the way a stone sinks in still water, not dramatically, just steadily, inevitably, while the world above continued exactly as it had before. Her coworker Donna, 50-something, raspy-voiced, the kind of woman who'd clearly survived several lives already, used to watch her wipe down the same table for the 3rd time and say, "Honey, you're polishing nothing. What's going on in that head of yours?" "Nothing," Mara always said. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth. The truth was that some mornings, in the fluorescent hush of the diner before the first customer walked in, Mara would catch her reflection in the dark window glass and barely recognize the woman looking back. Hollow under the eyes, hair pulled back too tight, like even her hairstyle had given up trying. She used to want things, a small garden, a dog with a yard to run in, maybe kids someday, though that thought now arrived with a flinch attached to it, like touching a bruise you forgot was there. She had wanted, once, to feel necessary to someone. Instead, she felt like static, background noise in her own life. So when the call came, an unfamiliar number, a lawyer's clipped, professional voice asking, "Is this Mara Ellison, formerly Mara Whitlock?" She almost didn't answer. She almost let it go to voicemail, the way she let most unfamiliar numbers go, assuming it was a collections agency or someone trying to sell her an extended car warranty for a car she didn't even own anymore. But some old, stubborn instinct she thought Daniel had finally killed, made her pick up. "This is she," Mara said, wiping her hands on her apron, stepping into the small back hallway by the walk-in freezer where the signal was strongest. "Ms. Ellison, my name is Robert Finch. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Eleanor Whitlock." Mara blinked. "I'm sorry, who?" "Eleanor Whitlock," the man repeated patiently. "Your late husband's great-aunt." Mara almost laughed. Daniel barely spoke to his family. She'd met maybe 3 of his relatives in the 2 years they were married, and none of them named Eleanor. "I think there's been some mistake," she said. "Daniel and we're divorced. Finalized 2 months ago." There was a pause on the line. The particular kind of pause that makes your stomach tighten before you even know why. "I'm aware of that, Ms. Ellison," Finch said. "Mrs. Whitlock passed away 3 weeks ago. Her will was very specific. She named you, not Daniel, as the sole inheritor of a property in Hollow Pine in the northern county. A cabin and the land it sits on." Mara stood very still in that narrow hallway, the hum of the walk-in freezer behind her like a held breath. "Me," she said slowly. "She left it to me?" "Specifically to you," Finch confirmed. Apparently, she was quite insistent on the wording. "I have it here if you'd like me to read it." Mara's hand had gone cold around the phone. She wrote, "To Mara, who I believe will understand what to do with it when the time comes." The silence that followed felt enormous. "I don't understand," Mara whispered. "I only met her once. At our wedding. We barely spoke." "I can't speak to her reasoning," Finch said. "But the property is yours, free and clear, if you choose to accept it. I should warn you, though, it's not exactly a desirable asset. The cabin's been empty for years. No utilities. The land assessment lists it as low value. Most people in your position would simply sell it as is and move on." Mara looked down at her hands, chapped from dish soap, a faint grease burn healing on her wrist from the diner's fryer, and felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in a long, long time. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too dangerous a word to use yet. It was curiosity. A door, cracked open in a hallway she didn't even know existed. "Send me the address," she said. "I want to see it." Hollow Pine wasn't on most maps anymore, not the ones people actually used. Mara's GPS lost the signal twice on the drive up, the blue dot freezing mid-route, like even the satellites had given up trying to track something so far from anywhere that mattered. It took her 4 hours. The highway thinned into a county road. The county road thinned into a gravel path, and the gravel path thinned into something that could generously be called a road, but felt more like a suggestion. 2 tire ruts pressed into the earth by people who'd given up on this place decades ago and never bothered to come back. The trees here were old. Not picturesque old, not postcard old. Ancient in a way that made the car feel small. Pines that blotted out the afternoon light until the world outside her windshield turned the color of dusk. Even though it was barely 2 p.m., Mara gripped the steering wheel and felt, for the first time in months, genuinely far from everything. Her apartment, her ex-husband, the diner, the version of herself that flipped chairs down at 5:47 every morning. She almost turned around twice. But there was a pull, something she couldn't name. Maybe it was the strangeness of being chosen by a woman she'd met for exactly 11 minutes at her own wedding reception. A woman who had pressed Mara's hand between both of hers and said, with an intensity that had felt almost out of place at the time, "You're stronger than you know, dear. Remember that." Mara hadn't thought about that moment in 2 years. Now it echoed. The cabin appeared suddenly, the way important things sometimes do, not gradually revealed, but simply there, as if the forest had been hiding it on purpose and finally relented. It was smaller than she expected. Squat and low, built from heavy gray stone the color of an overcast sky, with a roofline that sagged in the middle like an old horse's spine. Moss had crawled up one entire wall, thick and green-black, and the single visible window was either boarded or simply too grime-coated to see through. A chimney leaned at an angle that defied a few laws of physics. The front door, dark wood swollen with decades of rain, hung slightly open on one hinge, as if something, or someone, had left in a hurry and never come back to close it properly. Mara sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and felt her earlier curiosity curdle into something close to disappointment. This was it. This was the great inheritance. The mysterious gift from a woman who'd looked her in the eyes and told her she was stronger than she knew. A crumbling stone shack in the middle of nowhere, worth, by Finch's own estimate, barely enough to cover the property taxes someone would have to pay just to keep it standing. Of course, Mara murmured to the empty car, a small, bitter laugh escaping her. Of course it's this. She thought of Daniel's voice in her head, not malicious, just dismissive, the way he used to be about anything that didn't immediately serve his definition of success. He would have taken one look at this place and called it a write-off before she'd even gotten out of the car. Maybe he would have been right. But she hadn't driven 4 hours into the middle of nowhere just to sit in a parking spot of dead pine needles and turn back. She stepped out. The air here was different, colder than it should have been for the season, and carrying a mineral smell, like wet stone, and something underneath it she couldn't quite place. Old smoke, maybe, or something that had once burned and never quite finished burning. Her boots crunched over a stone path nearly swallowed by weeds. The closer she got to the door, the more the cabin seemed to loom, not large, but dense, the way a held breath feels dense in your chest. She pushed the door open. It groaned, not theatrically, just tired, the sound of old wood remembering it used to move easier. Inside, dust hung suspended in the thin shaft of light from the doorway, swirling lazily, disturbed for what might have been the first time in years. The air was cold and still, carrying that same mineral smell, stronger now, mixed with something dry and papery, like the inside of an old book left too long in a damp place. Mara stood in the doorway and felt the strangest sensation settle over her. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. The cabin's main room was small enough that Mara could see almost all of it from the doorway, and yet something about it refused to feel fully visible, as if the shadows in the corners held more depth than the dimensions should have allowed. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, cold and black with old soot, flanked by a pair of heavy wooden chairs that had survived the decades remarkably intact, though a thick layer of dust had turned their upholstery the gray of old bone. A narrow staircase, barely wider than her shoulders, curled up into darkness on her left. To her right, a kitchen area, primitive by any modern standard, a stone basin, a rusted iron stove, shelves that sagged under the weight of jars whose contents had long since calcified into something unrecognizable. She took a slow breath and stepped fully inside, her footsteps echoing oddly against the stone floor. "Hello," she said, immediately feeling foolish. No one answered, of course. No one had lived here in years. And yet the word hung in the cold air longer than it should have, swallowed slowly by the silence rather than simply fading. She ran her fingers along the edge of the mantelpiece, leaving a clean line through the dust. Above the fireplace hung a single framed photograph, the glass so clouded with grime she could barely make out the image. A woman, young, standing in front of this very cabin, her hand resting on the same door frame Mara had just walked through. The woman's expression was hard to read. Not quite a smile. More like the look of someone holding something back. Eleanor, Mara guessed, younger than she'd ever known her. She moved deeper into the room, and that was when she heard it. A sound. Faint. Almost nothing. A soft, rhythmic creak coming from somewhere above her, the staircase or beyond it. Mara froze. Her pulse picked up, quick and sharp. "Hello," she said again, louder this time, her voice tighter. The creak came again. Slow. Deliberate. Like a weight shifting on old floorboards. Every instinct told her to leave, to walk straight back out that door, get in her car, and drive the 4 hours home to a life that was at least predictably disappointing. But something else, something stubborn and curious that Daniel had never quite managed to extinguish, kept her feet rooted exactly where they were. She moved to the base of the stairs and looked up into the dark. "I'm not leaving," she said, to no one, to the house itself, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "This is mine now. Whatever you are." The creaking stopped. Mara stood there for a long moment, heart hammering, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. Eventually, with her phone flashlight trembling slightly in her grip, she climbed. The stairs opened into a single small room under the eaves. The ceiling sloped so low in places she had to duck. A narrow bed frame sat against one wall, stripped down to rusted springs. A wardrobe, doors slightly ajar, stood opposite it. And in the far corner, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket, sat an old wooden trunk, its surface carved with patterns Mara didn't recognize. Not decorative, exactly. Deliberate. Almost like a code. She crouched beside it, brushing away years of dust, and noticed something that made her breath catch. The trunk had a lock. A heavy iron lock, clearly newer than the trunk itself, bolted on with a precision that felt almost paranoid. Someone had wanted this kept shut. And someone, Mara realized, running her thumb across a small engraved plate on the lock's face, had left a single word etched into the metal. Later. Not a name, not a warning, just that single word, as if Eleanor Whitlock had known, somehow, impossibly, that someone would find this trunk someday, and had left instructions meant only for that exact moment. Mara sat back on her heels, staring at the word, feeling the cold air of the cabin settle around her like a held breath. Later. She didn't have a key, but she had a feeling, sitting there in the dust and the dark, that this cabin had far more waiting inside it than anyone, including the lawyer who'd called it a low-value asset, could possibly have guessed. Mara didn't sleep that night. She'd booked the only motel within 40 minutes of Hollow Pine, a flat, low building called the Cedar Rest with a flickering vacancy sign and a clerk who eyed her with the particular curiosity small towns reserve for outsiders. "You're the one who inherited the Whitlock place," the clerk said. Not a question. "Word travels fast," Mara said, surprised. "Word's the only thing that does travel fast around here." The woman, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, slid a key across the counter. "You be careful out there. That land's got a history." "What kind of history?" The clerk hesitated, just long enough for Mara to notice. "Ask old Pete down at the hardware store. He knew Eleanor better than anybody left in town." Then, almost as an afterthought, quieter, "She wasn't crazy, you know. Whatever people say. She just knew things she didn't talk about." Mara lay awake long after that, the trunk's single engraved word looping in her mind. Later, as if Eleanor had been speaking directly to her, across the gap of death, with a kind of patience that felt almost eerie. The next morning, she found old Pete exactly where the clerk said she would, behind the counter of a hardware store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the Carter administration. He was somewhere north of 70, broad-shouldered despite his age, with the weathered, watchful face of a man who'd spent his life paying attention to things other people overlooked. "You're Mara," he said, before she'd even introduced herself. "Eleanor's girl." "Ah, yes. I suppose I am." He studied her for a long moment, the way you'd study a key to see if it matched a lock you'd been carrying around for years. "She talked about you, you know, before she passed. Said her nephew's wife had something in her the rest of the family didn't." Mara's throat tightened. "We barely knew each other. We met once." "Doesn't surprise me," Pete said, returning to restocking a shelf of nails with unhurried hands. "Eleanor saw things other people missed. Always did. That's partly what got her into trouble." "Trouble?" He paused, glancing at her sideways, weighing something. "That land's been in dispute for near 60 years, off and on. Whitlock land used to stretch a lot further than that little cabin plot you've got now. There's history under that ground folks around here don't love talking about." "What kind of history?" Pete set down the box of nails and looked at her directly, and something in his expression made the hair on Mara's arms rise. "You found the trunk yet?" Mara's breath caught. "How did you?" "Everybody who's ever cleared that cabin's known about the trunk. Eleanor never let anybody open it. Not even her own brother. And believe me, he tried." Pete's jaw tightened slightly. "There's been interest in that land for years, Mara. More interest than a falling-down stone cabin ought to attract. You do well to be careful who you talk to about what you find up there." A small bell above the shop door jingled, and a man stepped inside, tall, polished in a way that looked deliberately out of place against the store's dusty shelves, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Mara's monthly rent. He smiled when he saw her, an easy, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mara Ellison," he said warmly, extending a hand. "I thought that might be you." "Grant Holloway. I represent a development group interested in the Whitlock parcel. I was hoping we might talk." Mara glanced at old Pete. His expression had gone carefully, deliberately blank. The look of a man who'd just watched exactly what he was afraid of walk through the door. "How did you know I was here?" Mara asked, her voice cooler than she intended. Grant's smile didn't waver. "Small town, Miss Ellison. News travels." But Mara had grown up enough in the last 6 months to recognize a particular kind of confidence. The confidence of someone who already believed he knew how this story would end. She intended to prove him wrong. Grant Holloway bought her coffee at the only cafe in Hollow Pine. A cramped little place with checkered curtains and a waitress who refilled their cups without being asked, clearly used to staying out of other people's business while absorbing every word of it. "I'll be straightforward with you," Grant said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the unhurried precision of a man who'd never once in his life had to worry about money. "My firm is interested in acquiring several parcels in this area for a development project. Your land happens to sit at the center of it." "The lawyer told me it was practically worthless," Mara said, watching him carefully. "No utilities. No real structure to speak of. Low assessment value." "Land assessments rarely capture the full picture," Grant said smoothly. "I can offer you $80,000. Cash. Quick close. No inspections required. No repairs needed. You walk away today, essentially, with a number most people in your position would call life-changing. $80,000. Mara felt the number land somewhere deep in her chest, heavy and tempting. She thought of her apartment, her 2 jobs, the math she did every night before falling asleep. $80,000 would fix all of it. It would fix more than fix it. It would give her room to breathe for the first time in years. And yet, she thought of the trunk, the single engraved word. Later, she thought of Eleanor's hand, soft and certain, closing over hers at a wedding reception 2 years ago. "You're stronger than you know, dear." Why does a development firm want a falling-down stone cabin with no utilities? Mara asked quietly. Something flickered behind Grant's eyes, small but unmistakable. A recalibration. "Land is land, Ms. Ellison," he said, his smile tightening just slightly at the edges. "We see potential where others see liabilities. That's simply what we do." "That's not really an answer." Grant set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I'd encourage you to consider the offer seriously. These opportunities don't tend to remain available indefinitely." It was the closest thing to a threat Mara had ever heard delivered in a tone of complete politeness. She drove back to the cabin that afternoon with Grant's business card sitting on her passenger seat, like something faintly radioactive, and old Pete's words circling in her mind. "There's been interest in that land for years, Mara. More interest than a falling-down stone cabin ought to attract. A man doesn't offer $80,000 for nothing." She parked, climbed out, and stood looking at the cabin for a long moment. Really looking at it. The way you look at something once you suspect it's been lying to you about what it is. Then she went back inside, climbed the narrow stairs, and knelt once more in front of the locked trunk. "Okay, Eleanor," she said softly into the dust-thick silence. Laters apparently now. She didn't have a key, but she had determination and a small crowbar she'd found leaning against the stove downstairs, and roughly 6 months of pent-up frustration that had been looking for somewhere to go. The lock resisted for a long moment. Old iron, stubborn, unwilling to give up its secret easily, the way the whole cabin seemed unwilling. And then, with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the small room under the eaves, it broke. Mara sat back, breathing hard, staring at the open trunk in front of her. Inside, beneath a folded square of oilcloth gone stiff with age, lay a stack of papers, yellowed, brittle at the edges, and resting on top of them, gleaming faintly even in the dim light, something that made Mara's breath catch entirely. A ring of old keys. And beneath the keys, a single photograph that was not the same young Eleanor from the mantel downstairs. This one showed 2 men standing in front of the cabin, and one of them, despite the photograph's age, despite the decades that separated that moment from this one, looked unmistakably, impossibly familiar. Mara's hands trembled as she lifted the photograph closer to the thin light filtering through the boarded window. The man on the left was unmistakably younger, stiffer somehow, dressed in clothes that placed the photo somewhere in the 1960s. But the man on the right, broad-jawed, dark-eyed, with a particular tilt to his smile that Mara had seen 1,000 times across a breakfast table, looked exactly, eerily, like Daniel. Not Daniel himself. He hadn't been born yet. But someone who shared his blood so closely it made her skin prickle. She flipped the photo over with shaking fingers. Faded pencil, barely legible. Eleanor's father, Walter, and his brother Conrad. Hollow Pine, 1961. The year the mine closed. The mine. Mara sat with that word for a long moment, turning it over like a stone in her palm. She dug deeper into the trunk, setting the photograph carefully aside, and pulled out the stack of papers beneath it. Property deeds, brittle with age, the ink faded to a pale brown. Surveyor's maps with boundary lines that didn't match the current parcel Finch had described to her, lines that extended much, much further than the small plot the cabin now sat on. Mineral rights documents, dense with legal language she didn't fully understand, dated decades apart, some stamped, some signed. One with a notation in the margin that simply read, disputed. See attached. There was no attached. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, Mara found something that made her sit back hard against the wardrobe behind her. A small leather journal, the cover cracked with age, Eleanor's name written inside the front cover in handwriting that started steady and grew increasingly urgent toward the final pages. Mara opened to the first entry with hands that no longer felt entirely her own. I am writing this because someone, someday, needs to know the truth of what happened to this land, and why my family has spent 60 years pretending it doesn't matter. It matters. It always mattered. They just made sure no one who could prove it lived long enough to say so out loud. Mara read on, the cabin growing darker around her as the afternoon light thinned, too absorbed to notice or care. Eleanor wrote about her father, Walter, and his brother Conrad, about a mining survey conducted in 1961 that found something on this land far more valuable than anyone in Hollow Pine had ever imagined. Not coal, something else. Something the journal referred to only as the vein, never more specifically than that, as if even decades later Eleanor was afraid of who might read these words. She wrote about a company, unnamed, careful, the way you write about something you're still afraid of even after it's supposedly gone, that had pressured her father to sell the mineral rights for a fraction of their worth. She wrote about Conrad, who had refused, who had tried to fight the company in court, and who had died in what the official record called a hunting accident less than a year later. She wrote about her father, broken by grief and fear, finally signing away most of the land, all of it except this small plot, the cabin, which he refused, against enormous pressure, to ever let go of. I don't know if what's under this ground is still there, Eleanor had written, in handwriting that had begun to shake. I don't know if it's worth what they once believed it was worth. But I know my family bled for it, quietly, for 60 years, and I will not let it pass into hands that would simply cash it in and forget what it cost to keep. The final entry was dated only 8 months before Eleanor's death. I'm leaving this tomorrow. I don't know her well. I only spoke to her once. But I saw something in her eyes that I recognized. The look of someone who has been told her whole life that she is small and quiet and easily overlooked, when in fact she is simply waiting for the right moment to stop being overlooked at all. I believe she will understand what this land actually is once she's ready to see it. I believe she will protect it the way my family was too frightened to, in the end. I am sorry to hand her a burden instead of a gift, but I have run out of time to find anyone else. Mara sat in the dim, dust-thick room, the journal open in her lap, tears she hadn't expected blurring the final lines of Eleanor's handwriting. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter against the stone wall, a sound that, only yesterday, would have made her flinch. Tonight, it simply sounded like the house, finally, exhaling. Mara didn't sleep again that night, not really. She sat at the small table in the Cedar Rest Motel room with Eleanor's journal open in front of her, the surveyor's maps spread out beside it, trying to piece together 60 years of careful silence into something she could actually understand. By morning, she had a headache and 100 more questions than answers, but one thing had crystallized with absolute clarity. Grant Holloway had not driven into a town this remote, walked into a hardware store this specific, and offered $80,000 for a worthless stone cabin by accident. He knew something. The company he represented knew something. And whatever it was apparently still worth pursuing, 60 years after Eleanor's uncle had died trying to protect it. She called Robert Finch first thing. I need everything you have on the original Whitlock land parcel, she said, before he'd even finished his greeting. Not just the cabin plot, the full historical boundary. And I need to know who currently holds mineral rights on the surrounding land. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a professional recalibrating his assumptions about a client. That's a significant amount of digging, Ms. Ellison. May I ask what's prompted this? I found Eleanor's journal, Mara said simply. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Mara checked to see if the call had dropped. "I see," Finch said finally, his voice carefully neutral in a way that told her it was anything but. "I should mention, Ms. Ellison, Eleanor retained me for a reason beyond simply writing her will. She left a sealed letter, to be opened only if you came to me with specific questions about the land's history. I have it in my office. I think it's time you read it." Mara's pulse quickened. "I can be there in 4 hours. I'll be waiting." She hung up, looked at herself in the cracked motel mirror. Tired, yes, still tired, but something else now too. Something that hadn't been there 6 months ago, or even 6 days ago. A kind of focus, a kind of fight. She thought of Daniel, somewhere out there living his challenged new life, completely unaware that the family he'd barely bothered to introduce her to had handed her, almost by accident, the key to his 60-year-old secret. She thought of old Pete's careful warning. "There's been interest in that land for years, Mara. More than a falling-down cabin ought to attract." She thought of Conrad Whitlock, dead in what the official record called an accident, less than a year after refusing to sign away what he'd found. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara Ellison felt something other than tired, or small, or easily overlooked. She felt afraid. And underneath the fear, quiet but unmistakable, she felt something that frightened her almost as much. She felt ready. Robert Finch's office sat above a dry cleaner in the county seat, a modest space with the particular hush of a profession built on careful words and carefully guarded secrets. He was younger than Mara had pictured from his voice, maybe 40, with tired eyes and the kind of meticulous handshake that suggested he took his obligations seriously, even the strange ones. "Eleanor was very specific about the conditions for this letter," he said, retrieving a sealed envelope from a locked drawer in his desk. "She said you'd know you were ready to read it when you stopped asking whether the land was worth something and started asking what it had cost." Mara's breath caught. That was almost exactly the question she'd been sitting with all night. She opened the envelope with hands that had finally, mercifully, stopped shaking. Eleanor's handwriting again, but different from the journal, more controlled, more deliberate, like a woman who had rewritten this letter many times until she was certain every word was necessary. "If you're reading this, then you've found the trunk, and you've started asking the right questions, and Robert has decided you're someone worth trusting with the rest. There is something under that land. I won't pretend otherwise, not anymore." In 1961, a survey commissioned by my father identified a significant deposit. Not coal, not the gravel they pretended it was for the official record, but a rare mineral vein that, even at 1960s prices, was valued in figures that frightened my family more than they excited us. Today, with modern uses for that mineral and technology my father couldn't have imagined, I am told, by people I trust, carefully, quietly, over many years, that the value could be substantial. I won't put a number in writing. Numbers like that have a way of getting people killed. I watched it nearly happen to my own family. The company that approached my father in 1961 is not the same company approaching you now, at least not on paper. But Robert can tell you what he's learned about its current ownership, and you will understand, I think, why I never trusted any offer that came wrapped in urgency. The land that matters is not just the small plot where the cabin sits. The original Whitlock boundary, before my father was pressured into selling off most of it, extended nearly a mile further north. I have spent 40 years quietly, carefully, buying back small adjoining parcels under a different name whenever they came up for sale, reassembling what my father lost piece by piece, parcel by parcel. Robert holds the records. Combined with the cabin plot, you may hold more of the original land than you realize. I am not leaving you a fortune, Mara. I'm leaving you a fight. I'm sorry for that. But I have to believe, that you are exactly the kind of person who can finally win it, where the rest of us were too afraid, or too tired, or too alone. You are not alone. Robert will help you. Old Pete will help you, if you ask him directly. He was Conrad's closest friend, and he has waited 60 years for someone brave enough to need that help. Whatever you decide to do with this land, I ask only one thing. Don't let it disappear into the hands of people who only see what it's worth and never what it cost. With more faith in you than you probably believe you deserve. Eleanor. Mara set the letter down on Finch's desk, her hands finally, completely steady. How much land? She said quietly. Did Eleanor actually reassemble? Finch slid a folder across the desk. Deeds, maps, parcel records spanning 4 decades, patiently, quietly accumulated by a woman everyone in Hollow Pine apparently believed was simply eccentric. Including the original cabin plot, Finch said, you currently hold title to just under 300 acres of the original Whitlock land. Roughly 70% of what your husband's great-great-uncle originally owned, before the 1961 sale. Mara stared at the map in front of her, at the careful, decades-long patience of a woman she'd met exactly once, who had spent her entire life quietly undoing a wrong that everyone else had simply learned to live with. And Grant Holloway's company, Mara said slowly. What do you know about who they really are? Finch's expression turned grave. I know enough, he said, to recommend we proceed very, very carefully. Grant Holloway called 3 more times over the following week. Mara let 2 go to voicemail and answered the 3rd only because Finch advised her to. Better to understand the shape of the pressure than to ignore it and be surprised by where it eventually landed. Ms. Ellison, Grant said, his easy charm slightly more brittle than it had been over coffee. I wanted to follow up. I understand you've been doing some research into the property's history. Small town, Mara said. News travels. A pause. She could almost hear him recalibrating again. I'd like to revise our offer, Grant said. 120,000. That's an extremely generous figure for an undeveloped parcel of that size, Ms. Ellison, and I'd encourage you to consider it seriously before. Before what? Mara asked, keeping her voice level, the way she'd practiced with Finch the night before. Before circumstances make a sale less straightforward, Grant said, and for the first time, something cold slid beneath the polish in his voice. Mineral rights disputes can become complicated, expensive, time-consuming. Some of my firm's partners are less patient than I am. There it was, the thread, finally stepping out from behind its careful manners. I appreciate your honesty, Mara said. I'll be in touch through my attorney from now on. She hung up before he could respond, her hand trembling slightly, but her resolve, for the first time in this entire strange unraveling, completely intact. Finch, when she called him immediately after, was quietly pleased. That confirms what I suspected, he said. I did some digging of my own. Holloway's firm is a shell, a development company on paper, but it's funded entirely by a mining conglomerate based out of state. The same conglomerate, as it happens, that absorbed the company your husband's family sold to back in 1961. They never stopped wanting it, Mara said quietly. They never stopped knowing what it was worth, Finch corrected. There's a difference, and it matters. Mineral surveys from the 60s are notoriously imprecise compared to modern testing. If your land does hold what Eleanor's journal suggests, the actual value could be, he paused, choosing his words with evident care. Significant, possibly far beyond what $120,000 would represent. Mara sat with that for a long moment. The diner's fryer grease smell and her cramped apartment and the careful, defeated math she used to do every night before sleep feeling suddenly very far away and very close, all at once. I don't want to sell, she said finally. Not yet. Not until I understand exactly what we're sitting on and exactly what it would mean to actually develop it or protect it. That's the right instinct, Finch said. But I should warn you, Mara, and I don't say this lightly. Conrad Whitlock died refusing this same pressure 60 years ago. I'd encourage real caution moving forward. These people don't tend to lose gracefully. Mara looked out the motel window, toward the dark line of pines that hid Eleanor's cabin somewhere beyond the ridge, and thought about a woman who had spent 40 patient years quietly undoing her family's fear, one small parcel at a time, without ever once letting anyone know what she was building toward. Eleanor wasn't afraid to fight for this, Mara said. I'm not going to be the one who finally lets it go. The independent mineral survey took 11 days to complete. Mara spent every one of them in a strange suspended state, working her shifts at the diner because rent still needed paying and old habits didn't dissolve simply because the world had cracked open, but carrying inside her, the whole time, the quiet hum of something enormous waiting to be confirmed or disproven. Donna noticed the shift before Mara even said a word about it. You're different, Donna said one slow Tuesday afternoon, refilling the ketchup bottles with the unhurried rhythm of someone who'd watched 1,000 small dramas play out over this same counter. Standing up straighter. What happened to you? Mara almost laughed at how impossible it would be to explain. I inherited something, she said instead. I'm still figuring out what. Old Pete called twice during those 11 days, each time with the same careful, weighted tone of a man checking on something fragile he'd waited a long time to see survive. Conrad would have been glad, he told her during the second call, his voice rougher than usual. He always said the land would matter again someday, once somebody brave enough came along who wasn't already broken by it. I think he meant you, even though he never met you. Eleanor used to say the same thing, near the end. I'm not sure I'm brave, Mara admitted. I think I'm just tired of letting things happen to me instead of deciding things for myself. Same thing, in my experience, Pete said. Bravery's usually just stubbornness that finally ran out of other options. The survey results arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, delivered by Finch in person, his expression carefully composed in the way of a man who had learned long ago not to let his face give away a client's news before she'd had the chance to read it herself. Mara sat across from him in his small office, the folder unopened on the desk between them, and felt the entire last 6 months of her life. Daniel's careful, folded shirts, the diner's burnt coffee smell, the cold stone cabin and its locked trunk, Eleanor's patient, decades-long letter, compress into this single, suspended moment. Just tell me, she said quietly. Finch opened the folder. The deposit is real, he said. Larger, in fact, than the 1961 survey suggested. Modern testing methods found additional reserves the original assessment missed entirely. Conservative estimate, accounting for extraction costs and current market value. He slid a single page across the desk, a number circled near the bottom in steady black ink. Mara looked at the number for a long moment, certain she was misreading it. She wasn't. It was not a number that fixed a budget or covered a month's rent or even changed a single year of someone's life. It was a number that changed everything that came after it, indefinitely, completely, for as long as she chose to let it. Mara, Finch said gently, watching her absorb it. You understand this changes the entire situation. Holloway's firm isn't going to walk away quietly now. If anything, the pressure is about to get considerably worse. Mara set the page down, her hands steady, her mind moving somewhere strange and clear and entirely her own. Good, she said. Let them try. The pressure arrived exactly as Finch predicted, swift and considerably less polite than Grant Holloway's careful coffee shop manners. A formal legal challenge appeared within the week, contesting the validity of several of Eleanor's decades-old land purchases, claiming irregularities in old paperwork that had sat undisturbed and unquestioned for 30, even 40 years. Mara recognized the strategy immediately, even without Finch's careful explanation, not an honest dispute, but an attempt to bury her in cost and confusion until walking away seemed easier than fighting. This is what happened to Eleanor's father, Finch said grimly, reviewing the filing. Different decade, same playbook. Overwhelm the smaller party until the math of fighting back stops making sense. What's the math now? Mara asked. Legal fees to properly contest this could run well into 6 figures, Finch admitted. It's a war of attrition, Mara. They're betting you don't have the resources or the will to outlast them. Mara thought of Eleanor, 40 years of quiet, patient parcel buying, never once revealing her hand until the moment she'd judged someone finally ready to receive it. She thought of Conrad, dead in a hunting accident the same year he refused to sign away what he'd found. She thought of her own mother, years ago, gone now, who used to say that some fights weren't really about winning. They were about refusing to be the generation that finally let go. What if, Mara said slowly, an idea taking shape even as she spoke it aloud. We don't fight this the way they expect. She spent the next several days doing something that surprised even Finch, not retreating into legal defenses alone, but reaching out, carefully, deliberately, to journalists who covered environmental and land rights stories, to a small university research team studying historical mining displacement in the region, to a state representative whose office, it turned out, had been quietly tracking complaints about this same mining conglomerate for years. You're not just defending the land, Finch observed. watching the strategy unfold with something between alarm and admiration. You're making it impossible for them to fight you quietly. Eleanor said she didn't want it to disappear into the hands of people who only see what it's worth. Mara said, I think the only way to actually protect that is to make sure everyone's watching. The story broke in a regional paper 3 weeks later. A careful, well-researched piece about a young widow-turned-divorcee who'd inherited a forgotten stone cabin, uncovered a 60-year-old land dispute, and was now standing against a powerful mining interest that had quietly displaced a family once before and was apparently prepared to try again. It wasn't a viral sensation. It didn't need to be. It only needed to reach the right desks. Grant Holloway's call stopped entirely after that. The legal challenge was quietly withdrawn 2 weeks later, buried in procedural language that amounted, Finch explained with a tired, satisfied smile, to a company deciding that public scrutiny was considerably more expensive than simply walking away. Mara stood in the cabin's main room the day Finch called with the news, sunlight finally cutting clean through the window. She'd spent a weekend carefully cleaning, dust motes drifting gold instead of gray. She thought of Eleanor's letter. I'm not leaving you a fortune, Mara. I'm leaving you a fight. We won, Mara said softly, into the empty room, half expecting, even now, to hear that faint creak on the stairs answer her back. It didn't come, but for the first time since she'd walked through that door, the silence didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like rest. A year is a strange unit of measurement for transformation. It is somehow both far too short and far more than enough. Mara no longer worked the 5:47 a.m. shift at Patterson's Diner. She still visited sometimes, still sat in her old booth, still let Donna refill her coffee without asking, because some habits aren't worth breaking just because you finally can. The cabin still stood, stone walls patient as ever, but it looked different now, restored carefully, deliberately, not erased of its history, but honored by it. The trunk sat in the main room still, empty now, its lock replaced but left unlocked on purpose, a quiet symbol Mara had insisted on even when the contractor suggested it might be easier to simply store it elsewhere. Some things, she'd told him, are supposed to stay open once you've finally gotten them open. She had not, in the end, sold the mineral rights to anyone. After months of careful research, careful conversations, careful weighing of every option Finch laid in front of her, Mara had instead established a conservation trust over 200 of the 300 acres, land that would never be mined, never developed, protected permanently in Eleanor's name and, quietly, in Conrad's too. The remaining 100 acres, under heavily negotiated terms with a far more reputable extraction company than Holloway's firm had ever represented, would be developed slowly, responsibly, with environmental safeguards Mara had insisted on personally, line by line, in meetings where she'd once have felt too small and too tired to speak up at all. The income from that careful arrangement hadn't just changed her life. It had let her change other people's. She'd started small, a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name for young women in Hollow Pine pursuing education or starting small businesses, the kind of quiet, practical support Mara herself had needed at 25 and never received. She'd helped old Pete's granddaughter open the bakery she'd been saving toward for years. She'd funded a local legal aid clinic, specifically focused on land disputes and inheritance fraud, staffed in part by Finch himself, who'd taken to the work with an enthusiasm Mara suspected had been waiting years for the right case to wake it up. You didn't have to do any of this, Finch told her one afternoon, watching the clinic's modest grand opening from across the street, a handful of Hollow Pine residents filing through the door with the particular hopeful caution of people in use to anyone offering them real help. I know, Mara said. That's sort of the point. She thought, sometimes, about the woman she'd been a year ago, flipping chairs down in a diner before dawn, doing quiet, defeated math before falling asleep, believing, somewhere underneath everything, that she'd been left behind by a life that had simply decided she wasn't worth keeping. She understood now that she hadn't been left behind at all. She'd been left something. Something quiet and overlooked and easy to dismiss at first glance. Something that had asked nothing of her except the patience to actually look closely and the courage to keep going once she didn't like what she found. Eleanor had been right, in the end, about more than just the land. Mara stood on the porch of the restored cabin one evening in early autumn, the air carrying that same mineral scent she remembered from her very first visit, the pines beyond the property line gone gold and copper at the edges. Somewhere down the hill, the scholarship fund's first recipient, a quiet, sharp-eyed 19-year-old named Josie, who reminded Mara achingly of herself, was touring the cabin grounds with old Pete, asking question after question about Eleanor, about Conrad, about a family that had finally, after 60 patient years, gotten its story told. Mara watched them for a long moment, a small, unguarded smile settling over features that had spent so long learning to expect disappointment instead. She thought about Daniel, somewhere out there in a life he'd chosen because this one hadn't felt challenging enough. She hoped, genuinely, that he'd found what he was looking for. She had found something she hadn't even known to look for at all. Not a fortune, though there was that too. Carefully invested, carefully shared. Not even justice. Exactly. Though there was a measure of that as well, 60 years overdue. What she had found, standing on that porch with the cold stone solid and warm beneath her bare feet, the cabin no longer haunted but simply, finally, home, was something far harder to name and far more valuable than any number Finch had ever circled on a page. She had found out exactly who she was, once nobody was around to convince her she was small. And she intended to spend the rest of her life making absolutely certain that no one ever convinced her of that again.